Strategies based on imitation are transparent to competitors who have already mastered them. Moreover, successful competitors rarely stand still. So it's not surprising that many executives feel trapped in a seemingly endless game of catch-up, regularly surprised by the new accomplishments of their competitors. For these executives and their companies, regaining competitiveness will mean rethinking many of the basic concepts of strategy. As strategy has blossomed, the competitiveness of Western companies has withered. This may be coincidence, but resourcefulness, the pace at which new competitive advantages are being built, rarely enters in. In this respect, traditional competitor analysis is like a snapshot of a moving car. By itself, the photograph yields little information about the car's speed or direction, whether the driver is out for a quiet Sunday drive or warming up for the Grand Prix. Yet managers have learned through painful experience that a business's initial resource endowment, whether bountiful or meager, is an unreliable predictor of future global success. This is from the Harvard Business Review magazine from 2005. It is from an article that became famous, an article that also became this beautiful little book that I have, Strategic Intent, written by CK Prahalad, and our guest for this series that is just magnificent, Gary Hamel. Welcome back.
Yeah, nice to be back. 2005. I think it actually was originally published maybe earlier than that, maybe sometime in the 1990s.
The magazine was where I first stumbled across it, and it's published there. But also, as I said, it's published in this beautiful book. What I really, really wanted to share about this one, Gary, was let's imagine these names are just generified, that they're your company today. Because Gary talks about companies in the 1970s. Him and CK really studied companies like that. Gary has deep expertise in Eastern culture and Eastern business. And you said in 1970, few Japanese companies possessed the resource base, manufacturing volume, or technical prowess of the US and European industry leaders. But companies like Komatsu, which had less than 35% as large, yet they pounced upon competitors. They came from below, which is a really important aspect of today's show, and they took them by surprise. Maybe we'll give an overview again for those people who may have missed our early episodes where we talked about CK, but where you and he really explored the East and saw how they took advantage of our mental atrophy or strategic atrophy in the West.
Yeah, it's easy to take an endowment for granted. So the fact that your company has a long history, the fact that you maybe have loyal customers, the fact that you have a large installed base, the fact that you are located in a country with a lot of resources, a lot of technology, great universities, and so on, it's just easy to take that for granted and assume that that somehow insulates you from what is going on in the world. And I think you're right, Aidan. I think you saw it when we wrote that many years ago, and you see it now. You see a certain kind of, I don't know if intellectual laziness is the right word, but certainly complacency. I think if you look at what has happened, you look at Europe, that has struggled outside of a couple industries like maybe automobiles and pharmaceuticals, has really struggled to maintain its place in the world. The US has also deep challenges in semiconductors, in advanced computing, in material science, and so on. Every company is either moving forward or going backwards, but there is no standing still. And, there's no ability to rely on history as a guide to what happens next. So I do think having that perpetual healthy anxiety, that concern, and as we talked about a bit last time, avoiding the tendency to just kind of discount or explain away new challenges or new competitors and so on, that's part of what I was talking about. And just the absolutely critical role that ambition plays in strategy. At the time I was writing that, CK and I were writing that, and it's still true today. Strategy was mainly seen as, we're in this industry. Are we in this segment? Are we in this segment? Where do we price? What channels do we use? It was kind of this very static kind of chess game kind of thing against a known set of competitors. And then somebody comes along and kind of throws the chess pieces in the air and says, like, let's think about this in a very different way. So you have to not only have superior resources, but you have to have superior foresight and a bigger dose of ambition if you're going to hope to stay relevant.
I thought I'd just touch on something before we get into the article and that concept of strategic intent. Something you touched on there, and we talked about it before we came on, is actually apportioning the time to think and the discipline of that, the discipline to learn, and how much of a competitive advantage that is in this day and age where we outsource that thinking oftentimes to consultants, but we don't have it in our essence in the company. And for me, it's changed my career. This learning from brilliant people like yourself, actually reading the book, which is just, I mean, that should be a price of entry, a price of admission to actually read the book, but it's so rare to actually sit through and read that book. And even getting people to attend conferences, as you know well, as I know well, is so difficult to pry them away from the doing to doing more thinking. And I just thought you'd share your concept on it because it seems to be getting worse.
Well, I think it is. And I think, several things are at work there. 2 or 3 things that come to mind immediately. One is so many people who are writing, creating content in the world of business and management and so on, today with social media and so on, just feel compelled to create content all the time, whether it's really deep or worthwhile or not. I remember a couple of years ago having some conversation with some personal branding consultant, and of course their whole goal is, "Hey, Gary, you need to blog every day and write something every." I go like, I just don't have that many really breakthrough ideas every day. They're hard to come up with a really new way of thinking, something that hopefully is kind of profound, illuminating, frame breaking. Writing every day, but almost you just guarantee it's just triviality. But so we're just like awash in content, and it's not easy to kind of sift through that and go like, well, what's really worthwhile and what's going to last? I think the second phenomenon is like our attention now is so fragmented. You go to many of these magazines online, and like the first thing they tell you is how long it's going to take you. You're like 3-minute read, 5-minute read, right? Like, don't tell me it's a 20-minute read. Dear God, I can't spare 20 minutes. And at the same time, we're all sitting around binge watching, right? So, but we just, our attention is splintered. And so, what you see is just like all these listicles, 5 ways to do this or whatever. Everything, you want to be like digestible and easy and whatever. Well, there's nothing that's digestible. There's nothing easy. There's nothing quick that's going to make a profound difference in anybody's life or in their business. And so, I think that's part of it. I think, the kind of meta level thing is obviously we're all of us are still stuck in these old organizational models and assumptions and so on. One of the books that probably influenced me almost more than anything else was Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which I'm guessing must have been written in the 70s, maybe 80s, maybe even before. But, he went back and the question he was asking is, why does science proceed like not smoothly, but in these leaps, right? Kind of punctuated equilibrium. And what he argued was that in any field of science or inquiry, you get stuck and you get a dominant way of thinking, and it is preserved and kind of almost an intellectual hegemony, and it's preserved by, the elite, those who have a stake in that way of thinking. And it takes an overwhelming amount of evidence and new thinking before you kind of break free of that and go like, okay, well, that was kind of stupid. Like maybe we should think about it this way. And I remember what he said. He said, the future's almost, and he was talking about science, but it's true generally. The future's almost always created by people who were young and or had no stake in the status quo. So I think, whoever you are, if you care about building an organization that is more capable than average, that is better than average, you have to look for ideas, insights, and so on that are not average, right? That are surprising to you and may indeed come from outside the world of kind of management. And because most of what's written in, I can pick up a management book, a business book, and I usually don't even have to get all the way through the preface before I know whether it's worth reading or not. If it basically takes 90% of the existing way we think about strategy, management, market as a given, okay, maybe it's helpful to you if you're like a beginner and you're starting out. been around a while, been inside organizations for a while, you really have to make a concerted effort to look for things that are kind of outside the norm. And sometimes those things will be stupid, right? And you go like, well, that was wacky. The highest compliment I ever get is when somebody reads something I wrote and say, Gary, this was like completely illuminating and unexpected, but completely logical. That's what you're going for. So I think, some of the people we've talked to through our interviews, like Bill Gore, who started WO Gore, or Zhang Rumen at Hire, these people were deep students of management thinking, right? And, if you start to think about management, really this very important social technology, we'll come back to this, but you really want to understand what we take for granted, what is the state of the art, what's out on the bleeding edge. I would guess that most people in management and business, they don't read one management book, business book a year. Like, what the heck? Like, how do you stay up to speed? When I first met Zhang Rumen, when I was in his office in Qingdao, he had a giant wall filled with every management book that I could imagine, like a century's worth. And he could quote it and he knew it. So, yeah, we have to avoid this tendency to be lazy and to be content with the incremental and the trivial and just take the time to look for the deeper truths.
And that thing you said, like the best business people I know are learners. They're constant learners and unlearners. They challenge. I was thinking about when you were saying that about Kuhn and the Planck principle, Max Planck, the whole idea that science advances because people die off, and how you told me, and I learned from you, how the same happened with generals. They actually used the same old strategies and were killing people on their own. And they only changed and adopted the new technology because the generals died off. But I was thinking about that deeply, that the same thing happened. I don't know if you know this, when say you were a professor or you put out some scientific paper, that young challengers don't challenge that paper until that person dies off because of the fear of the consequence of speaking truth to power and saying, I actually disagree with that, which I thought was absolutely incredible, which speaks to what happens inside organizations as well.
Yeah, the tendency for powerful people to deflect to challengers is pretty much a story of human nature and so on. And last time we talked a little bit about, the need for senior people to really welcome dissent and to seek out people who have different points of view. I think for CK, and I must say a lot of this I learned from him, or at least it was instinctive for him, and hopefully it became instinctive for me. CK was born in India, an influential family, but outside of the Western world, the world of business and so on. Did his PhD at Harvard. I started out in my undergraduate career at a very small college. And I think both of us kind of felt like outsiders, right? It wasn't the usual, I used to describe this, and this is not the way I would describe it anymore. It's probably slightly mean to say it, but I used to talk about the Harvard McKinsey kind of axis, right? And, the people who had come up through those systems and in those institutions and were venerated for their wisdom and so on. And yet, they were all drinking the same bathwater. They all had more or less the same way of thinking about things. And I think CK and I both really challenged ourselves to take an outsider's view, or maybe you call it a beginner's mind view. And in any conversation, the question we'd ask, like, okay, what are people not talking about and why? What are the assumptions that everybody has that maybe are worth challenging? Or like, how does all of this reinforce the self-interest of the people we're talking to, right? And those, you just train your mind to ask those questions. What are people talking about? What are the assumptions they haven't challenged? What about this supports their own self-interest? Are there any contrary examples anywhere in the world that might help us think differently about this? Is there a whole nother field of inquiry that has principles that might illuminate this, right? And you train, I think I mentioned sometime before, and it's even more true in the world of AI, that, it's impossible to create value by knowing more. You only create value by knowing different. So kind of training yourself to have that outsider's point of view, and almost by definition, sometimes it will make you like, you'll have some enemies and it'll be seen maybe as, I don't want to say a crank, hopefully not that, but certainly as, yeah, that guy's a little bit off on the fringe. But I don't know of any other way to really say something that's new and worthwhile. Otherwise,
Brilliant, man.
it's an echo chamber.
Absolutely. And I love, visual way of thinking through cartooning as well. My version is metaphor. Metaphor helps me stick the content to so it stays with me. And one of the metaphors that came to mind is to do with strategic intent. I started to write an article, as I do, about mostly because I have so much content from great books like this, and then I let it marinate, and then something will happen, and I go, oh, that's that thing in real life. And the great movie director James Cameron, the guy who brought us movies like The Abyss and Terminator, I read about what happened with him with Terminator. He had this great strategic intent. He had this real ambition about creating this amazing machine, and the technology just wasn't available yet. But he really put a massive challenge to the technologists and tried to push them, but they just weren't able to push far enough. So that was Terminator 1. It was only a 6 million budget. And then he made the movie The Abyss, and the technology had come on. And he made, if anybody remembers this liquid kind of alien, undersea alien. And then Terminator 2 came along, and he was able to do what he wanted for Terminator 1 and Terminator 2 and made a massive box office hit. And I thought about how it's exactly what you talk about in this article, in this book, is the strategic intent drove them, but also they were willing to go as far as the capabilities would bring them, but then build new capabilities. And then there's a shift in the market someplace and they're unlocked.
Yeah. That's, I think everybody, somewhere in your life, you need to have this thing in the back of your head, this thought that says, wouldn't it be great if? Something that's ambitious, something that you would like to do. Certainly James Cameron had this vision of what he wanted to communicate, what he wanted to see on the screen, right? But couldn't quite bring it to bear. But that's the only way you create the future, right? You have to have, and I think just so many of us are just captive to what is and struggle to think about what could be. When we're told all the time, well, that's like impossible, can't do that, that's not going to work. I mean, I have that experience like literally almost every day where I challenge somebody or some organization, whatever, and like, well, has anybody ever done that? And I'm not sure that's possible. Does the technology allow it? And there's hardly even the willingness to say, okay, let's just think about whether that's a worthwhile thing to do. And now let's see okay, how might we do? It's just the impulse to make immediate judgment, right? And like dismiss or not based on immediate feasibility is so deep in how we think. One of the I've been reading, I think I mentioned this name, and he's somebody as well, Ian McGilchrist. And then I've been reading a book by David Bentley Hart called, I'll get the title wrong, but I think it's something like The Gods Are in All Things. But it's really a treatise on human consciousness and particularly kind of on the left brain, right brain. And Ian McGilchrist writes about the same thing. And I think, in business that we've just way over-indexed on pragmatism. We way over-indexed on like supposed rationality. In other words, like left brain rationality. And, so you have organizations that are just not capable of doing great things. And of course, if you're a bureaucrat, bureaucrats are paid to root out unhelpful exceptions, right? Variances that, degrade quality or whatever. Well, the danger is that after a while, every variance looks, every exception looks to you like a threat. And so, as you've seen in public and private sectors, kind of the ratio of bureaucrats to everybody else goes up. There are fewer exceptional ideas or things that like get any oxygen. And so organizations become more mediocre. And so that's very much the spirit of that piece on strategic intent, that you have to work to imagine a what before you have a conversation about the how. And like, and work backwards to then invent the how, right? Rather than just assuming that, when Komatsu, and I used to teach that case, it's an old case, I doubt it's taught anymore, but the case of Komatsu versus Caterpillar. And of course, Caterpillar's a fine company. I think, they're still around and doing great, but Komatsu is also a very strong company and came kind of out of nowhere. But Komatsu had this ambition that was completely unwarranted by size or resources, right? Let's encircle Caterpillar. And of course, they did that by going to the markets where Caterpillar wasn't so strong, where, the markets weren't so big or whatever in developing countries and so on, and built out their strengths, much like Chinese companies have done more recently. But you can just imagine like, Maru, what? Are you insane? So yeah, that's why, as I've probably mentioned, but I'll say it again. Very few organizations are genuinely resource constrained, but many are ambition constrained.
Absolutely love it, man. And the Komatsu case in this paper, you talk about their ambition, their strategic intent was to encircle Caterpillar. I love that. And the language of that is really important because sometimes it's a sidestep around them. But the concept of coming from below, the way I think about this is the military term, which is undermining. And many people don't know what it actually means, but it's like when there's a big castle wall around a castle, the idea was that soldiers would bury under the wall and build a wooden structure to be able to hold up the ground. And then they'd leave it and they'd burn the structure and literally the walls would come tumbling down. So what was their strength now became their weakness and they were undermined. And this is what all these companies did. They undermined their competitor. Canon wanted to beat Xerox. Honda strove to be the second Ford, which was important as well. But they were high ambitions, like James Cameron we talked about. But they came from below. And many of the US kind of looked at them, saw them, didn't see them as a threat or had outsourced to them in the first place. And then they went at the weak parts of the market. And I really, really, if there's nothing else we get across today, Gary, it's that history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. That's exactly what happens. Banks with these competitor banks, they often gnaw away at pieces of the customer pie that the banks don't want or don't see worthwhile. And then they build capability over time and they come and they encircle them from below.
Yeah, I think what is easy often to see is a competitor's tactics and their resources, but what is much harder to see are their intentions. And so you can assume, and so you want to spend a lot of time thinking about, like, what do they say about this company? Who are these people? What are they setting out to do? Let me give a couple of contemporary examples, both of which happen to be kind of in sporting goods and sportswear. You look at the Swiss company On Running, and I spent a little time talking to those folks. You start and go like, well, this is like a little niche thing. They're somehow like claiming Swiss engineering and running shoes and that kind of precious. And like, let's see where this goes. Well, and then they just start building and building and building from there. And then you have all the running gear and the whatever. And then and of course, because initially they can't afford the big brand investments of a Nike or Adidas, they go to all the running clubs and they're like letting people try their gear and so on. And so, you had some super ambitious founders and, the thing is like, yeah, okay, like they're going to pick away at the margin. No, what if they want to go right after you, right? But obviously they're not going to attack you head on. By definition, as you said, you can't afford it. They die on the hill. So you find a way of undermining it. Another funny example, I don't know how successful they'll be. There's a company called Vice, like, VICE, that started out making golf balls, world-class golf balls, but for less than Titleist would charge, which is now maybe $60 a dozen or something. So they were maybe 60, 70% that and very, very good quality. So you can look at them and they were direct to consumer. So, and very little marketing. So you can say, all right, well, there's some like low end direct to consumer market for golf balls. Like that's fine. Well, if you look at them over the last 5 years, they steadily expanded into golf clothing. They're now making golf clubs that are very well reviewed. And, they're going to be a competitor to Titleist, to TaylorMade, whoever like is in that industry. So, the things you want to look at is, what's their velocity, right? How quickly are they gaining market share moving? What kind of people are they hiring? Are they hiring people with new skills? Is it clear they may be trying to build new capabilities? Exactly where are they investing? What are they patenting? So, you want to get a sense of velocity and trajectory, not just how big you are. We talked the other day about Adidas versus Lululemon, right? Oh, isn't this yoga thing kind of cute? Some organizations obviously do top out and end up being a niche. Don't think that Mercedes and BMW have to worry particularly about Ferrari, right? That's fine. But they sure as hell needed to worry about Hyundai and now their brand Genesis and so on. So worry about velocity, worry about intention, and to some extent about resources as well. But if you use resources as the barometer, you'll get surprised.
That thing about resources, I found this. We were talking, Gary has run events in the past and I'm running events now. But the thing I noticed was the importance of hunger. And if you're small and you're starting off, you're really involved. The founder's really involved, hunting things, going after things, being involved in everything. And then as you grow bigger and bigger, that becomes diluted, and that energy that comes from you, and then you hire in people, and of course they're not going to care as much as you care. And it's such a hard thing to not let happen as you get bigger and bigger. Minnows, a Komatsu at the start compared to a Caterpillar, or they were in some ways like the way Ford looked at Tata, for example, and kind of snuffed at them and laughed at them, and then they came and actually bought Land Rover, etc. That the hunger is what goes, and often, like a family company like Ford, generation after generation, that gets diluted as well. And it's just incredibly hard to keep that energy going. And one of the things you said on our last episode of Leading the Revolution, one of the penultimate episode, you were saying that it's just so few companies actually make it. They don't reinvent time and time again because it's just so hard to do so.
Yeah, and part of that you can argue, and people have had this, they say, Gary, why do we care whether companies are resilient or not? Why do we care about institutional longevity? Creative destruction comes, the old guard gets washed away, the new players come, this is a healthy thing. And in one sense, I for sure agree with that. I do not think we want moribund companies propped up by the state, nor do we want them using market power and killer acquisitions to kind of hold on to lost glory. So, yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm happy for startups. I'm happy for the youngsters and the insurgents who will come along and hold the geezers to account. Having one, companies are getting better and better at holding off the newcomers for a variety of strategies. And even large institutions do not die easily. I think General Motors has probably been losing market share for 40 years or 50 years, and it's still there. And yet they can waste a lot of society's resources, use their political clout and so on. GM got bailed out. So we do have to worry about the resilience of these organizations. The other thing is that, a lot of these large organizations have lots of employment. And when they fail, there's a large, large cost to society. So I kind of have the view both like, hey, I don't want to, we should never protect an organization from its own stupidity, right? Like that's not the job of the state or anybody else. Having said that, we do have an incentive in ensuring that these large organizations or any organization that has size and employees and whatever, like they have the best chance at reinventing themselves because that is better for society than just letting them slowly die or become moribund. So, you can believe both of those things simultaneously, that don't bail them out, but don't write them off prematurely either.
That was such a valuable point that I learned from you, that idea that we need them in countries. We actually need these. And there's a moral obligation on governments to keep them alive and to also save them from themselves in some case. Places like Ireland, we need that a lot over here. I wanted to just go into a couple of the characteristic of strategic events here. So you give a list of these characteristics. I'll have to jog your memory a little bit here. So I'll give you a little excerpt from each of them. The first was that strategic intent, once you establish what that is for you, like, for example, you say Coca-Cola was to have a Coke within arm's reach of everybody, that it's stable over time. So that was the first one. Strategic intent provides consistency to short-term action while leaving room for reinterpretation as new opportunities emerge. At Komatsu, encircling Caterpillar encompassed a succession of medium-term programs aimed at exploiting specific weaknesses in Caterpillar or building particular competitive advantages. When Caterpillar threatened Komatsu in Japan, for example, Komatsu responded by first improving quality, then driving costs down, then cultivating export markets, and then underwriting new product development. There's so much in there that can be learned by organizations for their own version of Komatsu versus Caterpillar.
Well, I think one of the things there is being able to look at strategy in maybe three time frames. There's, the next 90 days, what are we going to do? And what do we do differently? Do we make some new acquisitions? Do we re-vector resources in some way? Do we hire new people? There's a kind of year to 3-year time frame, and then there's the maybe 3-year plus. Well, I think in many organizations, it's that 1 to 3 years that is the real focus. So there's no broader, more ambitious goal that is challenge you to reinvent who you are, that is challenge you to re-vector and redirect. And in the short run, they are very tightly wired, very stuck, and can't move and have very little agility. And so I think the way I used to describe this, and I may struggle to describe this for a moment, is if you look at these ambitious companies, they have a lot of clarity around the goal and a lot of flexibility around the means, right? Like gorilla are constantly willing to rethink. Kind of the opposite into in many organizations, right? You are very vague and have very little clarity around the long-term goal and are very orthodox in the short run. It's like means more of the same. Well, who's going to outmaneuver who in that, in that scenario? And so, there's a general perception today that in a world of so much turbulence, it's impossible to have a longer term goal. I think that's completely wrong. I mean, obviously, the goal cannot be overly specific, right? When I think about Roche and whether this goal will survive over time, I don't know. But, their goal of creating 3 times the patient impact at half the cost, which requires you to think very differently about everything in your organization. You know, in most organizations, no one has the courage to set that kind of a goal. Because, the question everybody asks you is like, how? Is it worthwhile? Like, wouldn't that be fantastic? What you find in all these organizations, you work backwards from the future, not forward from the present. You work backwards from the future. And then you ask, all right, if that was our goal, what is a potential path? But what are those intermediate goals? I just think in most organizations, complete lack of clarity, ambition in the long term, hell of a lot of orthodoxy and incrementalism in the short term. That's a definition for slow death and stasis. But the reason I think we've got there is that a lot of executives lack the courage, maybe the imagination, but lack the courage to stake their colors to the wall and say, we're going to try to do something bold and it may take a while and it may not work. But you surrender the future to people who have more ambition and more agility.
And to link it back to what we talked about, so few leaders, certainly I've worked with, are learners. Until you learn, you don't know the value of that learning because it literally makes you think differently or rewires your brain differently. It's like different lenses to see the same thing as somebody else and see it totally different. And I think that is one of the reasons I started doing the show, was to learn more and to learn with witnesses. That's kind of the way I think about the show. But the value of that for a leader, because then that makes you think bigger and have a bigger strategic intent. And then combined with the next one, which is strategic intent, sets a target that deserves personal effort and commitment. And the way you frame this one is, ask the CEOs of many American corporations how they measure their contributions to their company's success. And you're likely to get an answer expressed in terms of shareholder wealth. In a company that possesses a strategic intent, however, top management is more likely to talk in terms of global market leadership. Market share leadership typically yields shareholder wealth, to be sure, but the two goals do not have the same motivational impact, especially on people down the organization. They're not going to wake up and go, today's going to be the day I'm going to improve shareholder wealth. But if it's something like, for example, you say, let's beat Mercedes-Benz as a Japanese auto producer, that's strategic intent.
Yeah, and a strategic intent, it doesn't have to be focused on a competitor. I think those are some of the examples we use. It can be focused on bringing a particular benefit to market or solving particular problems. The other benefit of having that greater ambition is that hopefully it frees you from or reduces the chance that you define your identity as a particular business model. I think of the battle between Amazon and Walmart over the years. The moment you define Walmart as like, we run super centers or hypermarkets or these big stores, then you live or die by that particular paradigm. If instead you say, we want to bring affordable goods to anybody who needs them through whatever means, then that opens you up. And so I think having an ambition that challenges you, it should challenge you to look beyond whatever's the current business model, the current whatever. We had this conversation about education, right? And if you're a business school dean and you say, hey, why aren't we reaching 10,000 students a year instead of 1,000? Okay, you're not going to do that with bricks and mortar. So I think without ambition, you're very likely, somebody described this to me once. I thought it was a nice analogy. They said strategic intent is like the sun that is bringing the shoots out of the ground. And so it should be something that is compelling enough. I say it needs to be both noble and ambitious, but compelling enough that it gives you a reason for moving outside of your comfort zone and for challenging kind of the status quo and recognizing where their limits are. And hey, we're not going to get there if we still are stuck here. But again, investors are part of the problem here too, because they'll immediately ask, like, well, how? And one of the risks, because I've seen the other side of this, Aidan, is you can get a company with a very ambitious goal, tries to accomplish it in an unreasonable time frame, and says, like, well, let's pour all of our resources and go hard at this. And as you said, the example of James Cameron, the technology may not be ready. You could have spent, when he was making whatever, Terminator 1, you could have had the biggest budget in the world, but there's certain things you can't do. And I've seen this over and over again where companies get very excited about something. They actually overinvest and then have to write that off. And then that creates a deep skepticism about that. Well, that was stupid. Why do we do that? And then they go sit on the sidelines and, nothing happens. So it's, you have to, and again, I used to have kind of ways of helping companies score all this. I don't know where even how to find that anymore, but you do have to think really hard about feasibility. And, is this going to require fundamentally new science? Does it just require some new technology? Who is likely to push back on this? Are we going to face regulatory hurdles? How quickly are our competitors likely to react? How much investment will this require? How can we offload that? I mean, there's a whole set of questions you have to go through. So you pace it, right? You want a lot of ambition, but you also don't want your spending to get ahead of what's possible or what you actually know, because that's called risk and failure. So it's a combination of audacity and prudence at the same time, which is, often one predominates at the expense of the other, which is not good.
And just for anybody wondering where to find that, you can find that in Competing for the Future. So there's a load of tools in there as well, and in Leading the Revolution. So you can go back and you can get those books still. So no excuse, they're out there and still as valuable as ever. I want to just move on to a couple of the other things. One of the huge things is, and this is where the education comes in, is that yes, even if you're an MBA or you have a PhD, sometimes you don't know the difference between strategic planning and strategic intent. So many companies I've worked in, that there was a bias towards action. And what many people saw as strategy was just being given a to-do list and a goal, a smart goal that it has to be done by a certain time. And that was the strategy. There was no magnetic gravitational pull to a bigger mission. And that is so rare in so many companies. So many people listen to the show. Yeah, my company doesn't have that. All this makes such a difference to what your purpose is and how you show up in the world.
But we should talk a little bit about where this intent comes from, because, in some cases, it just may come from a brilliant CEO. That's like great. I mean, I don't know who is leading Komatsu and where that came from, but often, that's not the case. So, when we've tried to help organizations create this, we do it with an open strategy process where we're getting hundreds of people together, generating thousands of potential strategic ideas, and then looking across those for the themes and the threads. And often the intent kind of emerges out of that almost by accident. You go like, wow, if we took all of this seriously, or if we moved in this direction, what does the future look like for us? Who are we becoming? And then that will get crystallized in a kind of a simple, provocative way. So in a way, I don't think it's largely a wordsmithing exercise. It's not like, hey, let's take the senior team to an offsite and come back with a strategic intent in a day. It has to come out of a lot of deep thinking about what's changing in the world. What do we want to be able to say about ourselves? How high is, what's an ambition that would justify the work that we're going to put into this organization, the lives of our people that are being spent in this organization? What would justify that? So when we've worked to create this, it's a much more extended conversation built out of a lot of data, what's going on in the world, what are our capabilities, what can we do next? But all the time saying, like, how big could this be? How high is that? I remember talking to a very famous venture capitalist, Steve Jurvetson, who funded Hotmail and a bunch of other stuff. And he said, I never look at a business plan. I never, because they're all bullshit anyway. The only question I want to ask somebody is like, how high is that? How big can this thing go? Paint me that picture and tell me that story and tell me broadly how you're going to get there. But again, not a conversation that we have in most organizations. It's just not. And there's never a conversation about the kind of 10x goal, right? And incrementalism prevails, and people are bored at work and intellectually turned off, and you get surprised by the future. Again, it's not that this work is so hard that it's hard to come up with an ambition, but it's just like we are so caught up in pragmatism and rationality and short-termism that even the conversations don't occur.
The way you put it, it was brilliant that a strategy is created in conjunction with some consultants with just the few anointed ones. And then, like Moses and the tablets, they come down, they go, here, do this. Essentially, there's a speaker. We're brought in maybe to speak at these events. There's nice pastries and tea, and everybody's happy. And then they're not happy because they have to execute this strategy. And you say, in this Silicon Valley approach to innovation, the only role for top managers is to retrofit their corporate strategy to the entrepreneurial successes that emerge from below. And here, the value added of top management is low indeed. That is such a key thing. And this is the important thing. And this is the James Cameron thing again. Strategic intent implies a sizable stretch for an organization. Current capabilities and resources will not suffice. And this forces the organization to be more inventive, to make the most of limited resources. Whereas the traditional view of strategy focuses on the degree of fit between existing resources and current opportunities. Strategic intent creates an extreme misfit between resources and ambitions, and top management then challenges the organization to close the gap by systemically building new advantages. And once again, I thought back to some of our previous episodes, how the US struggled in Vietnam, that whole idea of the bridges below the water, that was driven by necessity.
Yeah, I think once you have an ambition, then you start to say, okay, what are the big challenges we're going to have? And that can be appealing to a new sort of customer. It could be a technical challenge. And then you put that challenge out to the whole organization. Like, this is what we're up to. Like, what are the ideas? How are we going to do this? Back to Roche for a moment, in their planning processes, at least the way it worked when it was described to me, they will every year, against this broader goal of kind of reinventing the farm industry and so on, they identified 2 or 3 really key challenges every year. And it's not like, okay, we're going to give you an implementation plan. They ask dozens of countries around the world, dozens of their product groups, hey, if we really want to make progress, tell us what you're going to do in the next 90 days. I just want to know 90 days, what do we need to do to make progress on this? So it's a long-term aspiration with a lot of very short-term, high-velocity steps. But that intermediate kind of planning thing of the year to 3-year horizon, in some of these organizations, that doesn't even exist anymore. This doesn't create any value. It's basically a budgeting exercise. So, yeah, I mean, again, I'm sometimes a little pessimistic. I wrote that a long time ago. I think it won the McKinsey Prize, an article for the best article of the year, put in a little book. But if you say today, how many organizations have a genuine aspiration widely understood that goes beyond the next 24 months, I don't think it'd be a big number.
I can be pessimistic too on this because it's one of the reasons I do the show is to try and make it into a different media for people to be able to absorb in a different way. Maybe they're driving in traffic and they can't read, they have young kids, whatever. Maybe sandwich generation have to mind their parents or their grandparents. But there's so much wisdom in these books. And if you just put it into action, you're going to be so far of competitors. There's a couple of things you say here. So once you have your strategic intent, you got to, as you just said there, create a sense of urgency or a quasi-crisis. The second thing is develop a competitor focus at every level through widespread use of market or competitive intelligence. The next is provide employees with the skills they need to work effectively, which is rarely done. Give the organization time to digest one challenge before launching another, and establish clear milestones and review mechanisms to track progress and ensure that internal recognition and rewards reinforce desired behavior. One of the ones, pick on any you wish there, Gary, but the idea that give the organization time to digest one challenge before launching another, that's a key one because people have change fatigue, or maybe it's implementation fatigue of too many things at once.
Yeah, I think there's a temptation always, just as people are reluctant to set a goal that lies outside the range of planning, right? A goal that you cannot lay it all out. And so there's a reluctance to ever do those more ambitious, longer term things. There's also reluctance to give a challenge to the organization without already telling them exactly what's going to be required to get there, right? And here's the means, and here's how we're going to hold you accountable, and here's the 23 KPIs we're going to look at. And so, if you tried to overspecify the how initially, you close off a lot of innovation. People have come up with more creative ideas for how we might get from here to there. And so, yeah, I mean, I have to respect the organization's capacity to find the path, right? I cannot predetermine and tell them, like, this is the way we're going to do it exactly like this. And again, that makes leaders uncomfortable because, hey, we're supposed to tell them. And, and so what they do at Roche, they give these challenges. You have all countries kind of setting their own 90-day, what they call outcome-based planning. Okay, here's what we're going to do over the next 90 days. They just make that process transparent to everybody. So everybody can see all of those goals across the organization. And then they work hard to connect those teams together. Like, hey, you're working on this exactly. How do we share expertise and so on? Or I look at my goal and say, those over there make more sense to me. That's more likely to help us make progress. Maybe we should be doing that. So you will get the consistency over time and you'll get the coherence without having to predetermine all the means. But that's the instinct. Like, let's tell people exactly how to do this. And that's the enemy of learning improvisation.
I just want to remind people again, it's hard to read the label when you're inside the jar. So this could be you, and see that through these examples that Gary gives. So there's great examples in this small paper, and I'll share the link to that paper as well for people who want to read it. In the 1960s, Japanese producers relied on labor and capital cost advantages. As Western manufacturers began to move production offshore, Japanese companies accelerated their investment in process technology and created scale and quality advantages. Then, as their US and European competitors rationalized manufacturing, the Japanese added another string to their bow by accelerating the rate of product development. Then they built global brands. Then they de-skilled competitors through alliances and outsourcing deals. And the moral? An organization's capacity to improve existing skills and learn new ones is the most defensible competitive advantage of all. Yet, so few organizations consistently invest in their competitive advantage of those skills. And how poignant, how relevant is that for what we're seeing today?
Well, as you've said, history does kind of repeat itself, and you see what happened with Japanese competitors and happened with Korean competitors, happen now at a completely different scale with Chinese competitors. And some of this is just inevitable. The world moves up, and you have countries that had, for historical reasons, huge advantage. Right? There's a time when Britain and Germany dominated the industrial world, and the United States, and so on. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. But if you're a particular institution and you want to maintain your relevance, yeah, I think asking where are we going to be absolutely world class, and being clear, we're not going to surrender that. We're not going to outsource it. We're not going to, this is where we have to be world class. But also asking, what's the next layer of advantage that we build? So that was the success of Japanese companies, just layer after layer after layer, rather than saying, and getting stuck at some point. It was like, okay, what is the next advantage? And of course, eventually a lot of those companies did get stuck, and they surrendered the future. But yeah, I mean, I think Elon Musk put it well. He said the ultimate source of competitive advantage is the pace of innovation. And that's not innovation just in product terms. It's innovation in, every capability, every competence, every part of your business. And if you are moving faster than your competitors, you win. It's as simple as that. And if you don't, you lose. Velocity is important. But again, velocity without direction is chaos. It's Brownian motion. So that's the subtle challenge in all of this, Aidan. It's not simply let 1,000 flowers bloom. You need focus. You need coherence. You need to know that over time, we're working to build these advantages. We're working to this goal. So things are cumulative. So we capture those advantages of scale and scope. I don't want to recreate Silicon Valley and have just 1,000 unrelated things all bubbling up. But I do at the same time have to have a hell of a lot of focused improvisation and not believe that I can plan for the future, because you cannot. So that's my solution to this chaotic world we live in. You still need long-term goals. They need to be broad enough to survive a lot of short-term change. And then you need to be super flexible and improvisational in the short term, and worry a lot less about probably the medium term.
So next up, Gary, you say 4 approaches to competitive innovation are evident in the global expansion of these Japanese companies. They are building layers of advantage. We've talked about that. I love this one. Searching for loose bricks, changing the terms of engagement, and then competing through collaboration. And then you go on to say the wider a company's portfolio of advantages, the less risk it faces in competitive battles. New global competitors have built such portfolios by steadily expanding their arsenals of competitive weapons. They have moved inexorably from less defensible advantages such as low wage costs, to more defensible advantages like global brands. The Japanese color television industry illustrates this layering process. By 1967, Japan had become the largest producer of black and white television sets, and by 1970, it was closing the gap in color televisions.
Yeah, I think that whole article probably is a good tutorial for any company that you feel like you're in a world of giants and you're outgunned and out-resourced and, like, kind of, where do you go next? So, it is definitely having that ambition to start with. It is using, parlaying one advantage into another and not getting stuck at one layer and saying like, "Well, we gotta rely on others. We're never gonna get any better here." I think the loose brick idea is, yeah, where are these guys vulnerable? Where are they paying attention? Maybe a market, a customer group, something else. For Adidas and Nike, it was women and so on that they hadn't paid enough attention to. So where are they vulnerable? And yeah, I mean, I wrote a doctoral thesis on alliances and what you might call competitive collaboration. So, you outsource, you work with some wonderful example of that was Microsoft, convincing IBM to put the Microsoft OS Windows inside of, and IBM had this massive global presence. Microsoft was a tiny little company. And now you've like inserted your genome in this big beast and it's like spreading it all over the world. And then ultimately, Microsoft parts the company. So yeah, I mean, being very clever about how you leverage the resources and the strengths of those that are larger than you. It's interesting, and I'll get the data maybe a little bit wrong because I don't have it right in front of me. But literally over just like the last 5 or 6 years, now about a third of the molecules that big pharma companies are licensing in for new drugs are coming out of China. So you start to think again, what's the velocity? How do you go in space of 3 or 4 years from really having almost nothing to now a third of these new molecules are coming out of small Chinese biotech companies? Like, what do I need to be thinking about there? So, think about how you, rather than being afraid of these organizations much bigger, more resistance, like how do you leverage them? How do you use their size, right? How do you partner with them, but never give up on your own independent kind of aspirations and ambitions? I can't remember what the fourth thing that was there on this list, but yeah, that's what really being strategic means. Being ambitious, continuing to build layer after layer, looking for vulnerabilities, leveraging the size of those around you. And we reduce kind of strategy to this like annual, completely antiseptic budgeting exercise. I've said before, like strategic planning is an oxymoron. Like there's no such thing. There's planning and there's strategizing. They have like literally nothing to do with each other, except at some point strategies have to be translated into action. But even there, it's less about having strategies to elaborate plans and having strategies put into kind of a lot of short-term improvisation and high-velocity projects. We took a very powerful idea, strategy, and we reduced it to like a completely anodyne process of almost no value at all. If people listening find any of this interesting, the other thing they should read, which is worthwhile, is an HBR article I wrote a long time ago called Strategies Revolution. Basically makes the argument that core strategy is an innovation problem. It is, and it's not a planning problem. It's not a positioning problem. It's not an alignment problem. It's an innovation problem. And I think they maybe gain a few insights from that.
Uh-oh, we have another episode. We'll have to cover that, man, as well. But it's been an absolute pleasure. Really highly recommend that tiny little book. It's only, what is it? There's 90 pages, tiny little pages in it. So you'll fly through it. But don't fly through it. Take a week on it and treat it like you would treat another book. And then listen here as well. I love the color you add to this. And it's such a privilege to go through this with you and learn from you, and updated versions, the Roche, etc. All these examples. It's an absolute pleasure. Gary, for people who want to find you, I'll link to that article and to the other article. Where is the best place?
Happy to answer questions if people want to email me at gary@garyhamel.com. You can find me on LinkedIn easily enough, and always happy to engage there. On X, Prof. Hamel, if you want to follow me, and website, garyhamel.com. So always happy to engage.
Author of Strategic Intent, along with his friend CK Prahalad, may he rest in peace. Gary Hamel, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Aidan.